If one day everything in your life slips out of your hands, will you assume you took the wrong path, or consider that the old path is ending on its own to make room for a different direction? There are periods when nothing dramatic happens, yet you can feel that your inner foundation is no longer steady. Your job is still there. Your relationships are still functioning. You are still meeting your responsibilities. But what once made you think, "This is who I am," begins to lose its weight. You are not collapsing in a visible way. You simply realize that you are living inside a structure that no longer matches something deeper within you. Carl Jung did not see moments like this as failure. He believed they signal that the old ego has completed its role and the unconscious is beginning to reclaim its voice. The difficulty is that if you try to preserve the old image out of fear of losing control, the process stretches out and becomes more severe. Today, we will look directly at the moment when everything falls apart through Jung's lens, to understand why it may be a genuine beginning, not a beginning driven by new determination, but one that starts with seeing the collapse itself differently. Part 1. When stability becomes artificial. Before any obvious breakdown appears, there is often a much quieter phase, the moment when the stability you once trusted begins to reveal its artificial nature. No one announces it to you. There is no dramatic event. There is only a growing sense that you are living inside a structure that still has its shape, but no longer has its spirit. You still complete your work, maintain your relationships, and hold your position, but inside, the connection between the role and the real person begins to separate. You do not collapse. You simply begin to feel less and less present in your own life. The artificial quality here does not mean that you are living completely wrong. It is more subtle than that. It is like wearing a suit that once fit you perfectly, but your body has changed, and you have not yet realized it. The suit still looks good, still meets expectations, still receives compliments. Only you feel short of breath when you move. You tell yourself that you should be grateful because everything is fine. You try to convince yourself that the discomfort is temporary, but the body does not lie. The psyche does not lie either. Jung believed that a person cannot live for long in an outer form that no longer reflects the inner structure. When inner development moves beyond the image you are maintaining, conflict inevitably appears. He wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. Some problems cannot be fixed because their very nature signals that you have outgrown an earlier stage. At that point, stability no longer serves as a foundation for growth. It becomes a frame that confines you. What makes this stage difficult is that it rarely produces intense pain. Instead, it creates a gradual emptiness. You wake up, do familiar tasks, and achieve familiar results, yet your inner experience no longer feels aligned. You may still be successful, you may still be recognized, but the joy that once accompanied those achievements noticeably fades. You begin to wonder why you have to push so hard to maintain what once felt natural. This question is rarely spoken aloud. It simply repeats itself in your mind during unoccupied moments. This inner mismatch leads many people into a state of living on autopilot. They continue because they are used to continuing. They preserve an image because they have invested too much to let it go. They remain inside familiar structures because they fear not knowing who they would be without them. Stability is preserved through increasing effort, but the cost is inner contraction. You start avoiding thoughts that unsettle you. You postpone deeper questions. You keep yourself busy so that you do not have to face the feeling that something is slowly shifting off its axis. I once met a woman who had built her entire life around being the reliable one. She was always the problem solver, always strong, always composed. No one expected her to struggle, yet at a certain point, she began to feel irritated every time someone turned to her for help. She still helped, still delivered, but inside, there was resentment she did not dare admit. She told me that what frightened her most was not losing that role, but the thought that if she was no longer the reliable one, she would not know who she was. In her case, stability had become identity, and when identity no longer reflects the whole person, a crisis of meaning begins to form. This is precisely what Jung wanted us to notice. When outer life no longer corresponds to inner movement, the psyche will begin to self-correct. This correction does not arrive with a clear announcement. It shows up as a sense of disconnection, as unexplained boredom, as the growing heaviness of things that once felt important. This is not a material crisis. It is a crisis of meaning, and a crisis of meaning cannot be resolved by adding more goals or more motivation. Many people, once they detect these cracks, immediately try to reinforce the structure. They enroll in new courses, set new plans, change environments, and adjust strategies. These actions are not wrong in themselves, but if the root issue is that the old structure no longer fits, every attempt at reinforcement merely postpones the next fracture. Jung did not see such breakdowns as accidents. He saw them as the natural response of the psyche when a form has completed its purpose. What makes this phase especially uncomfortable is that you cannot point to a single clear cause. There is no obvious person to blame. There is no dramatic mistake large enough to explain everything. You only know that what once supported you no longer feels solid. That lack of clarity makes you doubt yourself. You wonder whether you are being too sensitive, too demanding, or too impatient. But from a Jungian perspective, this is not a flaw in your personality. It is a sign that a psychological stage is coming to an end. When you begin to admit that your current stability is no longer fully honest with who you are, another door opens. That door does not immediately provide answers. It leads to a deeper question. What inside you has changed that you have not yet acknowledged? What has been compressed to preserve the old image? From the awareness of this inner mismatch, the real journey begins. And this is the moment when the unconscious no longer remains quietly in the background, but starts moving forward, demanding to be heard. Part 2. When the unconscious begins to reclaim its voice. According to Jung, the unconscious is not the opposite of consciousness, but something far larger that surrounds it. Consciousness is like a small island in the middle of the ocean. When the island expands, the ocean does not disappear. It remains there with its own currents and pressure. If you live too long relying only on the island, you forget that you are surrounded by much deeper waters. At some point, the tide shifts, and when it rises, you can no longer pretend that the surface of the sea is always calm. The emptiness you feel is not meaningless space. It is more like a room that has been locked for too long. When the door finally opens, stale air rushes out, carrying the damp smell of things left unattended. The discomfort does not appear because the room is ugly, but because it has been neglected. The unconscious works in the same way. It holds the desires you pushed aside because they seemed impractical, the emotions you refused to feel because you feared judgment, the questions you avoided because they might destabilize the image you worked hard to build. Jung emphasized, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When the unconscious is not brought into awareness, it continues to shape your choices. You may believe you are deciding freely, but often you are reacting through patterns formed very early in life. You choose safety because you once feared abandonment. You choose stability because you once lived through chaos. You choose to appear strong because you once felt fragile. Those choices helped you survive. But if they are never re-examined as your inner world changes, they turn into limits. When the unconscious begins to reclaim its voice, what you notice first is not a clear message, but a withdrawal of energy from places that no longer feel true. You may still perform well at work, yet you no longer feel nourished by it. You may maintain a relationship, yet you no longer sense growth within it. The soul, in Jung's language, does not argue with you. It does not present a new strategic plan. It simply pulls vitality away from structures that no longer fit. And when the energy drains, you are forced to pay attention. I once met a man who spent years becoming the image of the perfect son. He chose the profession his family valued, behaved properly, and always put responsibility first. No one could criticize him. But at 35, he began to experience persistent headaches whenever he had to attend important meetings. Doctors found no physical cause. Over time, he admitted that every major decision in his life had been made to preserve that image. He had never asked himself what he truly wanted outside the gaze of his family. The headaches were not weakness. They were the unconscious demanding that he stop and look at a part of his life that had never been allowed to exist. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They assume that if the unconscious rises, it means they have taken the wrong path. In Jung's view, the issue is not that you walked the wrong road. The issue is that you played the right role for too long. You lived consistently with the image you chose. But that image never contained your whole being. When the excluded parts accumulate over time, they seek reintegration. That reintegration is uncomfortable because it disrupts the certainty you relied on. The pain that appears at this stage is not punishment. It is a sign that consciousness is expanding. When you begin to question values you once considered unquestionable, you find yourself pulled in two directions. On one side stands familiarity. On the other hand stands the sense that if you continue unchanged, you are betraying something inside. This tension is exhausting, yet it also shows that you are stepping out of automatic living. You are no longer entirely guided by old reflexes. The unconscious does not demand that you destroy your current life. It asks you to look at the parts that have not been lived. This may be a creative impulse you once dismissed, a need for rest you labeled as weakness, or a desire for change you called unrealistic. When these elements are acknowledged, they no longer need to express themselves through symptoms. Jung described this as the process of bringing unconscious content into conscious awareness, and he insisted that no psychological growth occurs without passing through this stage. When you allow yourself to listen instead of denying, the inner chaos begins to take shape. The questions become clearer. The dissatisfaction becomes more specific. This does not make life easier immediately, but it moves you from a passive state into an active dialogue with yourself. And once that dialogue begins, you cannot return to the old position without feeling false. For that reason, when the unconscious steps forward and demands recognition, a consequence becomes unavoidable. Part of the old structure must change. You cannot maintain the former image and remain honest about what you have just discovered. And this realization leads directly into the next phase of the journey. Part 3. The psychological death of the old identity. Identity does not appear out of nowhere. It is formed every time you are praised for being obedient, for being strong, for sacrificing, for doing more than expected. Gradually, you learn to become that kind of person, the one who keeps everything in order, the one who does not let emotions complicate things. That structure helps you survive. It gives you a place in the world, recognition, and a sense that you are valuable. But Jung repeatedly emphasized that the ego is only a temporary center of consciousness. It is necessary, but it is not the whole of who you are. And when you outgrow it, something begins to break. The psychological death of an old identity does not look like a clear decision. It is more like wearing a jacket that once fit perfectly, and one day, noticing the seams pulling in places, you can no longer ignore it. You can still force the zipper up. You can still stand straight to hide the tightness. But your body knows, and so does your psyche. When the structure that once helped you survive becomes too small for the person you are becoming, a crisis appears to crack that structure open. What hurts most is not losing an outer role. What hurts most is realizing that the person who once helped you live can no longer help you continue. You used to be proud of how much you could tumble. You believed that the stronger you were, the more loved you would be. But now, each time you carry everything again, a part of you feels betrayed. You no longer want to be the only strong one. You want to be a whole human being, including your exhaustion, including your private needs. Jung wrote that the greatest problems of life cannot be solved, only outgrown. You cannot fix an outdated identity and make it feel alive again. You cannot add a few new habits to a structure that has expired and expect it to fit. If your inner development has moved beyond it, the old ego must dissolve. There is no rebirth without disintegration. Imagine a tree that was tied to an iron frame when it was young, so it would grow straight. Years later, the trunk becomes thicker and stronger. If the iron frame is not removed, it will press into the bark, leaving deep marks, even distorting the tree's natural growth. The old identity was once that necessary frame, but if you keep it in place after you have grown, it becomes a restriction. I once knew a woman named Hannah. She built her entire life around being the one who never causes trouble. She did not demand. She did not complain. She handled everything on her own. People loved her for being easy and dependable. But at some point, she began to feel flashes of anger in very small situations. She started to resent the need to always be fine. In a therapy session, she said, "If I stop being the easy one, I'm afraid no one will need me anymore." That was the moment her ego revealed itself. The structure she built to be accepted was now suffocating her. In Jungian terms, this was the collision between ego and self, when the deeper center of her being demanded to live truthfully, not just to be approved. Psychological death does not erase you. It takes away your familiar definitions. You are no longer certain how to describe yourself. The labels that once gave you confidence begin to feel fragile. You may feel empty, but in reality, you are standing between two structures. The old one is falling away. The new one has not yet formed. The space in between is what frightens you. Many people rush to adopt a new identity to escape this suspension. They change environments, change lifestyles, change how they present themselves. But if the old ego has not truly dissolved, it will return in another form. You may shift from being self-sacrificing to being excessively independent. You may move from controlling everything to rejecting responsibility altogether. The form changes, but the core structure remains. As Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The pain in this stage does not mean you are wrong. It means your awareness is expanding. You are seeing parts of yourself you once avoided. You are admitting that you have lived inside a familiar role for too long, and that admission always shakes your balance. It is important to understand that you are not betraying your past when you allow an old identity to end. That version of you was necessary. It protected you. It carried you through difficult years. But if you hold on to it only because you fear the emptiness ahead, you will remain in a loop. The crisis will return in a different form until you accept that a chapter of your life has completed its work. The psychological death of an old identity is an unavoidable step in beginning again when everything falls apart. It is not the end of you. It is the end of a version that is no longer large enough to contain you. And when that outer shell finally drops away, you will find yourself standing in a space without labels, without definitions. That space will test you more than any external loss. And yet, if you do not rush to fill it, it is there that a more authentic structure can begin to form. Part 4. Staying in the void without rushing to rebuild. What unsettles most people is not the collapse itself, but the emptiness that follows. When there is no old role left to hold on to, a strong impulse rises. Do something immediately. Become someone else quickly. Prove that you are still fine, still moving forward, still in control of your life. This suspended feeling is like taking off a mask you have worn for too long. The marks are still on your skin. You are not yet familiar with the face that is no longer shaped for approval. And the first reflex is usually to look for another mask. This is the most dangerous stage. Not when everything falls apart, but when you rush to rebuild. Human beings tend to replace an old structure with a similar one that only looks different on the surface. You may abandon the image of the self-sacrificing person to become fiercely independent, but if the deeper drive is still the fear of not being loved, you are simply rotating around the same axis. You may walk away from control to live freely, but if that freedom is just a way to avoid responsibility for unresolved parts of yourself, you are still being led by the same psychological structure. Jung understood this clearly. He wrote, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. When you do not rush to fill the space, you begin to see that the chaos is not meaningless. It forces you to stop. It does not allow you to react through old habits. When there is no title, no role, you cannot answer the question, 'Who am I?' with achievements or responsibilities. And that very helplessness is what loosens the ego's grip. Staying in the space is not surrender. It is accepted that you do not yet know who you are becoming. This is especially difficult for those who have defined themselves through competence and function. When someone asks what you are doing with your life, and you do not have a clear answer, you may feel as if you are falling behind, but in reality, you are in a phase Jung considered rare, a phase in which the ego temporarily steps back so that a deeper center can slowly emerge. Imagine a room that has just been completely cleared after years of being packed with furniture and storage. Once everything is removed, the room feels cold and bare. You may panic and want to fill it immediately to restore a sense of familiarity. But if you sit in that room long enough, you begin to notice how the light enters, how sound moves through the space, how wide it truly is. You never saw those things before because they were always covered. The emptiness gives you the chance to experience yourself without being shaped by a role. There was a woman named Elise who left a 15-year relationship. For years, she defined herself as the one who kept the family together. When the relationship ended, she not only lost a partner, she lost her sense of herself. In the first months, She almost threw herself into new plans so she would not have to feel the emptiness. But eventually she realized that each plan was just a way to avoid a deeper question. If she was no longer the one holding everything together for everyone else, who was she? When she allowed herself to remain in that uncertainty, she began to notice desires she had never admitted before. In Jungian terms, this was the moment the ego stopped occupying the entire stage and the self began to have a voice. This space forces you to learn how to exist without proving anything. You can no longer rely on achievement to feel valuable. You no longer have a role to shield you from insecurity. You have to sit with yourself and with questions that do not yet have answers. That can make you feel exposed. But it is also the first time you are not reacting automatically. You are not chasing recognition. You are not rushing to repair your image. You are in an in-between state, and that state allows a new structure to form from within rather than being imposed from outside. If you rebuild too quickly, you will carry unexamined parts into the new structure. The crisis will return, perhaps in a subtler form, perhaps later, but it will return. If you are patient enough to remain in the emptiness, you begin to distinguish what genuinely arises from you and what is only an old reflex. You begin to hear parts of yourself that were once drowned out by the noise of responsibility and expectation. Staying in the space is not the final destination. It is a necessary transition. When you are no longer rushing, the parts that were once rejected or labeled inappropriate will gradually surface. Not like a storm, but like clearer signals. And that is when the journey moves into a deeper layer, where you are not only letting go of an old role, but beginning to face the parts of yourself you left behind for far too long. Part 5. Facing the neglected parts of yourself. If you stay in the emptiness long enough, you begin to notice something you used to avoid. There are parts of you that have never truly been lived. When you are no longer busy maintaining the old role, no longer occupied with protecting a familiar image, those parts do not appear dramatically. They slip in quietly through ordinary moments. A flicker of irritation when you are taken for granted. A hollow feeling when everything is running smoothly for everyone else and no one asks how you are. A passing thought that you may have drifted too far away from yourself. Jung called this region the shadow, but it is not something dark in a moral sense. It is simply the place where you store the parts of yourself that were inconvenient for survival in your environment. There were times you had to be strong because no one else would be. There were times you had to be reasonable, accommodating, and composed so that things would not fall apart. Over time, those qualities hardened into identity, but the price of that stability was pushing aside the parts that did not fit the image, the part that wanted to be prioritized, the part that wanted to rest without feeling guilty, the part that wanted to say, "I am not okay," instead of enduring quietly, the part that wanted to be seen, not only relied upon. Those parts did not disappear. They were simply moved beneath the surface. The shadow does not try to destroy you. It seeks recognition. When you refuse to look at it, it finds other ways to enter your life. You may notice yourself snapping over small things. You may feel increasingly distant in relationships that once felt close. You may feel exhausted without understanding why, even though everything on the outside still functions. These signs are rarely about new circumstances. They are the voice of what has been neglected, asking to be acknowledged. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When you do not recognize your own shadow, you begin to believe that the repetitions in your life are destiny. You do not understand why you keep falling into the same roles. You do not understand why you keep choosing silence over speaking. But once you begin to name what has been rejected, you realize you have a choice. Facing the shadow does not mean acting out every suppressed emotion. It is not rebellion, and it is not destruction. It is the simple act of admitting that your needs and feelings are valid, even if you once judged them as wrong. You can love your family and still need solitude. You can be proud of what you have built and still grieve what you never tried. You can feel grateful for your life and still want it to be different. I once heard a woman say she was never jealous. She believed jealousy was petty, yet every time she saw someone pursuing a path of their own, something tightened inside her. She dismissed it as negativity. When she finally admitted that she had once set aside her own desires, that tightness changed. It was no longer jealousy in a crude sense. It became information. It told her what she longed for. In Jungian terms, that was the moment the shadow moved from invisible pressure to conscious material she could work with. The neglected part is often the part you believed would cost you love or respect if it were seen. So you chose the safer standard. But living too long within that standard narrows you. You begin to feel as though you are performing a role rather than inhabiting a life. When you dare to look at the shadow, you do not become less. You become more real. You stop spending energy maintaining a stable image at all costs. You can say you are tired without pretending you have everything under control. You can set boundaries without labeling yourself selfish. You can admit that you want to be seen, not only dependent on. Wholeness does not mean eliminating the darker parts. It means you no longer split yourself into what is acceptable and what must be hidden. As the fragmentation decreases, you begin to feel your own energy more clearly. You are no longer stretched thin, maintaining appearances. You start to feel a center inside you, rather than relying entirely on external roles to define you. Beginning again, when everything falls apart, is not simply about finding a new path. It is about reclaiming the parts of yourself you left behind in the years you prioritized stability. When those parts are acknowledged and integrated, you no longer live just to meet a standard. You begin to live with a deeper sense of wholeness, even if the outer structure of your life has not changed dramatically. And when that fragmentation begins to heal, a quiet but unmistakable flow of energy returns, preparing you for a deeper inner restructuring that grows from within rather than being imposed from outside. Part 6. The silent inner restructuring. This restructuring does not happen like a revolution. It feels more like an internal shift of axis. You no longer want to spend your energy maintaining things you already know are no longer true. In the past, you may have used a great deal of strength to keep everything running smoothly, to make sure no one was disappointed, to prevent your image from cracking. Now you begin to see the cost of that effort clearly, and instead of pushing harder, you choose to pull back. You are no longer interested in quiet competitions. You no longer feel the need to over-explain your choices. Goals that once kept you tense and striving may suddenly lose their weight. Not because you have become less capable, but because the inner structure of your motivation has changed. When the ego no longer needs to prove its worth through achievement or sacrifice, what once felt urgent begins to rearrange itself. Jung did not see this process as self-improvement. He saw it as a redistribution of psychic energy, energy that was once trapped in conflict, in maintaining an image, in suppressing what you truly felt, is now released. And when energy is released, it does not become chaotic. It looks for a new order. Jung once wrote, The new thing always comes from the dark. What is new does not come from forcing yourself to become someone else. It appears when you stop resisting what you have known for a long time. You begin to notice the shift in concrete ways. There are relationships you once held onto out of duty or habit, and now you no longer have the strength to sustain them in the old way. You do not need to cut them off dramatically. You simply stop trying alone. And when you stop, the truth reveals itself. Connections built on something real remain. Connections built only on roles begin to fall away. There were things you once did because they helped you feel valuable. Now, when your worth no longer depends entirely on external recognition, you begin to ask a different question. Does this actually nourish me? And when the answer is no, you are calm enough to stop. This stopping is not dramatic. It feels like setting down a weight you have carried for far too long. A woman named Elaine once told me that after her period of crisis, she did not change jobs, leave her family, or move to another city. What changed was that she stopped being the one who handled everything. When problems arose, she no longer rushed in to fix them for everyone else. At first, she felt anxious, afraid that everything would fall apart. But she discovered that not everything collapses when she is not in control. What shifted was not her circumstances, but her inner position within them. This is the moment when the ego no longer occupies the entire stage, and a deeper center begins to orient her life. Your pace may slow down. You no longer chase the feeling that you must constantly move forward. You may decline an opportunity if you know it will exhaust you, even though in the past you would have accepted it out of fear of missing out. You begin to treat your body and your emotions as important data, not obstacles to overcome. This is not a weakness. It is a different way of operating. The core of this phase is that you do not force a new order into existence. You allow it to form. When you stop resisting the truth about your needs and your limits, a new structure emerges through small daily choices. You add less and begin to subtract. Fewer meetings that drain you, fewer goals that no longer belong to you, fewer roles you accepted simply out of habit. From the outside, others may not see much difference, but inside, you know you are no longer running on the old inertia. You are no longer driven by the need to prove. You no longer feel compelled to tell an impressive story about yourself. You feel lighter when you do not have to explain so much. When energy is no longer leaking into image maintenance and inner conflict, it gathers into a stable force. This force is quiet, but steady. It gives you a sense of inner grounding, rather than depending entirely on feedback from the outside world. And when that grounding becomes strong enough, you begin to sense a deeper shift taking place. You are no longer living primarily from the reflexes of the ego, but are gradually being guided by a deeper center within. It is from this shift that a truly new beginning can emerge. Part 7. Beginning again from the true self. This beginning is not like any of the starting over attempts you have made before. It does not begin with a plan, nor does it launch with a surge of determination. It begins with a very direct admission. You no longer want to live against yourself. In the past, you may have accepted choices that slowly drained you simply because they were reasonable, safe, or widely approved. Now you realize that reason is no longer enough. You need inner alignment. Jung called this process individuation, the conscious becoming of who you truly are. It is not about being different for attention, and it is not about withdrawing from society. It is about no longer losing yourself while living among others. You remain in relationships. You continue your work. You carry your responsibilities. but you no longer allow those roles to define the whole of you. When you begin again from the true self, you notice a clear shift in how you experience your own worth. Before, your value may have been tightly tied to what you achieved, what you produced, or what others thought of you. Now, your worth is no longer entirely dependent on those measures. You still do your work well, but you no longer need constant validation to feel that you matter. Inner stability becomes your reference point, and that inner stability becomes more valuable than ever. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." He called it a privilege because it requires courage. To live in alignment with the self, you must accept that not everyone will understand your choices. You must accept that some who were comfortable with your former version may feel unsettled when you change, but you are no longer willing to return to who you were, simply to preserve other people's convenience. This change is not loud. It shows itself in concrete decisions. You no longer pursue goals that leave you empty just because they bring achievement. You no longer remain in situations that exhaust you just because you fear judgment. When a choice appears, you can feel clearly whether your body contracts or opens, and you begin to trust that signal instead of overriding it. What matters at this stage is that you no longer live primarily to avoid loss. In the past, many of your decisions may have been driven by fear of being left behind, fear of being seen as a failure, fear of losing your place. When the self begins to lead, the motivation shifts. You do not choose in order to escape something. You choose because it is true for you. The difference is subtle, but it is profound. It creates a completely different foundation for your life. Beginning again from the self also means you take fuller responsibility for your choices. You no longer default to blaming circumstances when things do not unfold as you hoped. You know you chose based on honesty with yourself, and you accept the consequences that follow. For Jung, freedom is not the absence of responsibility. It is the capacity to live according to inner truth and stand firmly in it. As you live closer to the self, your relationships also change. You no longer need others to fill an internal void. You no longer require daily confirmation of your worth. This does not make you distant. It makes you more clearly present. You remain in a relationship because you want to be there, not because leaving would destabilize your sense of identity. A clear sign of this new beginning is that you no longer feel compelled to narrate your life in a complicated way to be accepted. You do not need to highlight your past, exaggerate achievements, or conceal your vulnerable seasons. You accept your entire path as part of who you are now. When you no longer have to defend an image, you have more energy to live authentically. Inner quiet becomes your new measure. If praise once lifted you and criticism once unsettled you, external feedback no longer holds the same power. You listen, but you are not governed by it. You know what aligns with you, even when no one agrees. This certainty is not rigidity, it is clarity. Beginning again from the true self does not promise an easier life. You will still encounter difficulty, loss, and change, but you no longer feel that you are playing the wrong role in your own life. You no longer feel compelled to become someone else to be accepted. You begin to live from your center rather than from the edges. So under Jung's lens, starting over is not about constructing a new version of yourself to replace the old one. It is the process of returning to a center that has always been there, though once covered by fear, expectation, and habit. When you live from that center, every choice, even a small one, carries a different quality. You are no longer seeking a perfect life. You are seeking alignment. And that alignment becomes the most solid foundation for a true beginning after everything has fallen apart. When life enters a fragile phase, what hurts you most is often not what you have lost, but the feeling that you no longer recognize yourself. You may still be working, still fulfilling your responsibilities, still maintaining a stable appearance on the outside. But inside, you know something has shifted off its former axis. The feeling is difficult to name, and it is precisely that inability to name it that unsettles you. Yet, through Jung's lens, this moment is not a sign that you have failed. It is the point at which the deepest part of you can no longer tolerate a way of living that feels untrue. The collapse does not come to punish you. It comes when a structure has completed its role, and whether you like it or not, your psyche will no longer allow you to shrink yourself to fit what has already expired. Beginning again, then, is not about trying to become stronger so you will never fall. It is about daring to live more truthfully, even if that means losing a few familiar comforts. Some of the most important steps are not steps forward, but the decision to stop forcing yourself into a role that no longer fits. When you stop living against yourself, a different kind of steadiness appears. It is not loud or dramatic, but it is solid enough for you to know you are moving in the right direction. If you find yourself in this phase, share a line of your thoughts in the comments so you do not have to walk through it alone. And if you want to continue exploring the journey of inner growth through Jung's lens, subscribe to the channel so we can go deeper together in the next reflections.